The stars looked like tiny white dots against the deep black of space. Inside a small research vessel, Sergeant David Kim sat quietly, watching the endless darkness through the ship's main viewport. The ship hummed softly, its systems running smoothly as it moved through the vast emptiness between solar systems. David was not your typical researcher. At 35, he had spent years in the military, serving in some of the most challenging environments on Earth. His dark eyes scanned the control panels, years of training making him alert even during what seemed like a routine mission. The United States Space Exploration Agency had sent him on this particular assignment, a research trip to collect data about distant star systems. His fingers moved across the digital screens, checking and rechecking the ship's systems. The vessel was small but well-equipped, designed for long-distance travel and scientific exploration. Specialized sensors hung outside the ship's hull, collecting information about radiation, particle density, and other complex space phenomena. Suddenly, a sharp beeping broke the calm silence. David's hand moved instantly to the communication panel. Red warning lights began to flash across the ship's control systems. Something was approaching, and it was big. Through the viewport, a massive shape began to materialize. It was unlike anything David had seen before. The alien vessel was enormous, easily 10 times the size of his small research ship. Its design was complex and angular, with sharp edges that seemed to cut through the darkness of space. Metallic gray with strange purple energy lines running across its surface, the ship looked both beautiful and terrifying. David's military training kicked in immediately. He wasn't just a researcher. He was a veteran of multiple special operations. His muscles tensed, and his breathing became controlled and steady. Years of training had prepared him for unexpected situations, even if those situations had never involved alien spacecraft before. Unidentified vessel, you are entering restricted space, a computerized voice suddenly announced through the ship's communication system. The voice was cold and mechanical, clearly not human. Prepare for boarding and identification process. David knew he had limited options. The alien ship had already locked onto his vessel with what appeared to be some kind of energy tractor beam. His small research ship was being slowly pulled toward the massive alien vessel, its engines now completely unresponsive. He quickly secured sensitive equipment and activated the ship's emergency data protection protocols. Years of military intelligence training had taught him the importance of protecting information. With a few quick keystrokes, he ensured that even if the aliens accessed his ship's computer, they would find nothing of real value. The docking process was smooth and precise. David could hear mechanical sounds as his small vessel was pulled into a massive docking bay. The ship's internal atmosphere began to change, adjusting to match the alien vessel's environment. 3 figures appeared at the airlock. They were tall, at least 7 feet high, with gray-blue skin that seemed to shimmer slightly under the artificial light. Their bodies were muscular, covered in what looked like flexible metal armor. Each carried a weapon that hummed with strange energy. Human personnel, identify yourself, the lead alien commanded. Its voice was deep and carried a hint of automatic translation technology. David stood calmly, hands slightly away from his body to show he was not a threat. Sergeant David Kim, United States Space Exploration Agency. He responded clearly and directly. The aliens exchanged a quick glance. They had expected a simple researcher, a weak human easily controlled. They did not yet understand who they had just captured. As the airlock opened and the first alien stepped forward, David knew this was going to be an interesting encounter. Little did the Galactic Empire know, they had just arrested a soldier who was far more than he appeared to be. The mission had just changed, and David was ready for whatever came next. The interrogation room was cold and bright. Harsh white lights made everything look sharp and clear. David sat in a metal chair that felt hard and uncomfortable. His hands were locked to the table in front of him, but he remained calm. Across from him sat Park, the lead interrogator of the Drakari space station. Park was not like the soldiers who had captured David. He was smaller, with lighter blue skin and eyes that seemed to study everything carefully. The thin device wrapped around his head, blinking with small lights that David guessed was some kind of translation and monitoring technology. "Sergeant David Kim," Park began, his voice coming through a translator that made it sound almost too perfect. "You are a researcher from Earth. Tell me about your mission." David looked directly at Park. His eyes were steady, showing no fear. Military training had taught him how to handle interrogations. He knew the important rule: say as little as possible while giving just enough information to seem cooperative. "Research mission," David replied simply. "Collecting data about star systems in this region." Park's eyes narrowed. Something about David's response didn't feel right to him. Most humans they had captured before would be nervous. They would talk too much or try to lie in complicated ways. But this human was different. The room had strange technology everywhere. Sensors lined the walls, monitoring David's heart rate, breathing, and even the smallest changes in his body. Small robotic devices moved quietly around the edges of the room, collecting additional data. "Your ship was far from normal human exploration zones," Park continued. "Why were you here?" David knew he couldn't reveal too much. "Standard research protocols," he said calmly. "We explore areas that other missions have not yet mapped." Park pressed a button on the table. A holographic screen appeared, showing details of David's ship, his background, and various pieces of information collected during his capture. Most of the sensitive data was blocked or appeared as strange symbols. "You are not a typical researcher," Park said. The hologram showed David's military service record: years of special operations, advanced training, missions marked as classified. "Your background suggests you are something more." David remained silent. This was another trick he had learned. Sometimes, saying nothing was better than saying something. The door to the interrogation room opened. Another Drakari official entered, taller and with darker skin. His armor looked more elaborate, suggesting a higher rank. He stood behind Park, watching David carefully. "His mental responses are unusual," the new official said. A device on his wrist was translating his words. "He shows no typical stress markers. Most humans become emotional or afraid during interrogation." Park nodded. "Exactly. He is different." David knew they were talking about him, but he showed no reaction. His face remained calm, his body still. Years of special forces training had taught him how to control his emotions and physical responses. The interrogation continued for hours. They asked about his mission, about Earth, about human space exploration. David answered with short, simple responses. He gave just enough information to seem helpful, but never revealed anything important. As the hours passed, Park became more frustrated. The other officials began to realize that this human was not like anyone they had captured before. David was playing a careful game, revealing nothing while appearing completely cooperative. "We will continue this later," Park finally said. The holographic screens disappeared. The robotic sensors stopped moving. David was taken to a secure holding area. The room was designed to hold prisoners from many different alien species, but none of the designers had ever dealt with a human like David Kim. As he was locked into his cell, David began to observe everything around him. The walls, the security systems, the movements of the guards. He was already planning, already thinking several steps ahead. The Drakari thought they had captured a simple researcher. They had no idea what they were really dealing with. The prison was unlike anything David had ever seen. It was a massive structure floating in space, built to hold prisoners from hundreds of different alien species. The cell walls were made of a strange material that looked like glass, but felt harder than steel. Every few meters, energy fields flickered, creating additional layers of security. David's cell was small but not uncomfortable. A simple bed, a water source, and a basic toilet were the only items inside. But David knew better than to think he was truly confined. His eyes constantly moved, studying every detail of the room. The first day passed quietly. David maintained a calm routine. He did simple exercises to keep his body strong. Push-ups, stretches, and careful movements that didn't draw too much attention. Military training had taught him how to stay fit in tight spaces. Other prisoners watched him carefully. The cell block was a mix of different alien species. To David's left, a creature that looked like a mix between a lizard and an octopus watched him silently. On the right, a tall, thin being with multiple arms sat completely still. During mealtimes, David noticed something interesting. The prison had a complex system for feeding different species. Some prisoners received liquid nutrition. Others got strange-looking blocks of food. David's meal was a neutral-looking protein pack, clearly designed to be safe for multiple types of bodies. On the second day, David began to map out the prison in his mind. He watched the guard patterns. He studied how the energy fields worked. He listened to the sounds of the prison. The hum of machines, the distant movements of other prisoners, the occasional mechanical announcements. A prisoner in the cell across from David caught his attention. The alien was different from the others, smaller with skin that seemed to change colors slightly. When the guards weren't looking, this prisoner would make quick, almost invisible movements. David recognized something in those movements. They were similar to the communication techniques he had learned in Special Forces training. Subtle signals that could pass unnoticed by most observers. Slowly, carefully, David began to communicate with this prisoner. Not with words, but with tiny hand movements and careful eye signals. It was a risky game, but David was a master at gathering information. The prison had a routine. Every few hours, guards would walk the cell block. They moved in pairs, always following the same path. Their armor looked heavy and complicated, but David could see weak points. Years of military training had taught him how to analyze security systems. On the third day, something changed. A loud alarm suddenly rang through the prison. Red lights began to flash. Most prisoners became nervous, moving back from their cell doors. But David remained calm. The alarm stopped after a few minutes, but David had learned something important. He had seen how the guards responded. He had noticed small details about their movement and communication. His color-changing cellmate across the way gave him a quick, almost invisible signal. David understood it as a message. Something was happening in the prison. Something big. The prison might think it could hold David Kim, but David was already planning his next move. As night fell, or what passed for night in this space station, David continued his careful observations. He stretched out on his bed, but his mind was fully alert. To anyone watching, he would look like he was sleeping. But David Kim was never truly at rest, and the Galactic Empire had no idea what was coming. The prison thought it was secure. It thought its prisoners were under control. But prisons are only as strong as their weakest point. And David was about to find that weakness. The testing room was bright and cold. Bright white lights made everything look sharp and clear. David Kim stood in the center of the room, surrounded by strange machines and alien scientists. Hyun Kwan watched from behind a glass wall. He was different from the other Drakari officials. His eyes were sharp, and he seemed more curious than angry. Something about the human prisoner had caught his attention. "Begin standard physical assessment," a computer voice announced. 3 robotic arms moved toward David. Each arm had different tools. Some looked like medical scanners, others like strength testing devices. The scientists expected a typical human response. They would soon learn how wrong they were. The first test measured physical strength. A massive metal arm moved to push against David's body. Most prisoners would struggle, but David stood firm. His muscles, trained through years of military service, absorbed the pressure like a rock. The robotic arm increased its power. Still, David did not move. The scientists looked confused. Their computer screens showed readings that made no sense to them. David's body was responding in ways they had never seen before. Next came a mental challenge. A holographic screen appeared, showing complex mathematical problems and spatial reasoning tests. The questions were designed to be impossible for most species to solve quickly. David looked at the screen. His eyes moved fast, analyzing each problem. In less than 3 minutes, David solved every single test. The computer screen began to flash with completed solutions. The scientists looked at each other in surprise. Hyun-Kwon leaned forward. Something was different about this human. The physical tests continued. David was asked to lift heavy weights, move through complex obstacle courses, and solve problems that would challenge multiple alien species. Each time, he performed better than expected. A device began to measure his pain response. Small electrical pulses were sent through his body, tests that would make most prisoners cry out in pain. David remained calm. His breathing stayed steady. The only sign of discomfort was a small twitch in his left hand. "Impossible," one scientist muttered. "No species should be able to do this." Hyun-Kwon watched carefully. He noticed things the other scientists missed. The way David moved, how he analyzed each test before responding, the calculated precision of his actions. The final test was the most strange. A mental challenge designed to break down psychological barriers. A holographic environment appeared around David, a complex simulation that changed every few seconds. Most prisoners would become confused or scared. David adapted instantly. His mind worked like a computer, processing each change, finding patterns, understanding the test's logic faster than the designers had thought possible. When the test ended, the room went silent. "Explain the human's performance," Hyun-Kwon said to the lead scientist. The scientist looked worried. "We have never seen anything like this before. His physical and mental capabilities are abnormal." David stood in the center of the room. To the aliens, he looked like a simple human prisoner. But behind his calm eyes was a mind that had been trained for the most difficult challenges on Earth. The Drakari had captured many prisoners, but they had never met anyone like David Kim. As the scientists continued to review the test results, David allowed himself a small, almost invisible smile. They were learning about him, but he was learning about them too. The game was just beginning. The prison was quiet during what passed for night in this massive space station. Most prisoners slept, but David Kim was wide awake. His cell looked the same as always, but David had been changing things, small things that nobody would notice. A loose panel here, a slightly modified energy line there. To the aliens watching, everything looked normal. The color-changing prisoner across from David's cell caught his eye. A quick hand movement. A signal. They had been communicating carefully over the past days. This prisoner was not what he seemed either. David knew the prison systems better now. He understood how the energy fields worked. He had tracked the guard movements. He had learned about the different alien technologies surrounding him. During meals, David had been carefully collecting small pieces of technology. A dropped sensor here, a broken communication device there. To the guards, they looked like simple pieces of trash, but David saw them differently. Using nothing more than the basic tools in his cell, David began to modify these pieces. His hands moved quickly and carefully. Years of military training had taught him how to work with technology, how to understand systems, how to make things work in ways they were not supposed to work. A small device began to take shape. It looked like nothing important, but David knew better. Hyun-Kwon, the alien official who had watched David's tests, came to the prison block. He looked different today, more curious, more interested in understanding the human prisoner. "Interesting human," Kwon said to the head guard. "Our tests show something unusual about him." David listened carefully. He did not move. He did not show that he was paying attention. Another skill learned from years of military intelligence work. The prison had different levels of security, different areas for different types of prisoners. David had been studying these areas carefully. He knew every camera position, every guard movement, every small detail that most prisoners would miss. His modified device was almost complete. It looked like a simple piece of broken technology, but David knew it could do much more. The colored-changing prisoner across the way gave another signal. Something was happening in the prison. Something big was coming. David had a plan. But plans in space prison are never simple. The guard rotation changed. New shifts came in. David continued to work carefully. His hands moved slowly. Anyone watching would think he was just sitting quietly in his cell. But David Kim was never just sitting quietly. He thought about Earth, about the training he had received, about the Special Forces team that had prepared him for impossible situations. They had taught him that no prison is unbreakable. No system is perfect. The device was ready. Outside the cell, the prison continued its routine. Guards walked their paths. Prisoners stayed in their cells. Everything looked normal. But something was about to change. David looked at the small device he had created. It was ready. He just needed the right moment. The Galactic Empire thought they had captured a simple human researcher. They had no idea what was coming. David Kim was about to show them exactly who they were dealing with. The prison might think it was secure. But no prison can hold someone who refuses to be held. And David Kim was definitely not going to be held. The explosion came without warning. A massive blast rocked the entire prison station. Alarms screamed. Red lights flashed everywhere. The carefully controlled environment of the alien prison suddenly became chaos. David Kim was ready. The blast had come from a different section of the prison. Most prisoners panicked. They'd pressed themselves against cell walls. Guards ran in all directions. But David remained calm. His training had prepared him for moments exactly like this. The color-changing prisoner across from David's cell caught his eye. A quick signal. A plan was in motion. David's modified device came to life. Slowly, carefully, it began to weaken the energy field of his cell. To the monitoring systems, everything looked normal. But David knew better. Prisoners from different species began to react. Some tried to break out. Others huddled in fear, but David saw an opportunity. This was more than just a prison riot. Something bigger was happening. Guards rushed through the prison block. Their heavy armor looked impressive, but David could see the weak points. Years of military training had taught him how to analyze security systems quickly. The blast had damaged the prison's main control systems. Communication between guard units became difficult. Some energy fields began to fail. Prisoners who had been carefully separated now had chances to move. David's cell door began to weaken, but he did not rush. Patience was a weapon, and he knew how to use it well. Hyun Kwon, the alien official, appeared in the central control room. He watched the chaos carefully. Something about this riot felt different. It was too organized, too precise. In the prison block, David began to move. Not to escape, not yet, but to help. A group of smaller alien prisoners were trapped. Their energy fields were failing, but they were too scared to move. David approached them carefully. His movements were slow and calm. "Stay together," he said in a language that seemed to translate automatically. "Follow my instructions." The alien prisoners looked surprised. A human was helping them. This was not what they expected. David guided the group of prisoners away from the most dangerous areas. He understood the prison's layout better than the guards. Each movement was calculated. Each step had a purpose. More explosions rocked the station, but David remained focused. He was creating a path, not just for himself, but for the other prisoners. The guards tried to regain control, but the riot was spreading. Different species of prisoners began to work together, something David had quietly encouraged during his time in the prison. Hyun Kwon watched the security cameras in disbelief. The human prisoner was not just surviving the riot. He was managing it, controlling it. "Who is this human?" Kwon muttered to himself. David moved between prisoner groups, helping, guiding, using skills that went far beyond simple military training. He was creating order in the middle of chaos. The prison station shook again. Another explosion. But David was ready. This was more than a prison riot. This was a turning point. The Galactic Empire had captured a human soldier, but they were about to learn that David Kim was far more than a simple prisoner. And this was just the beginning. The meeting room was silent. 5 top leaders of the Galactic Empire sat around a large circular table. Holographic screens showed images of the recent prison riot. At the center of the discussion was one person, David Kim. Hyun Kwon stood near the window, his blue skin looking darker in the low light. "The human is not a simple prisoner," he said quietly. "He is something more." The lead commander, a massive alien with deep red skin, looked angry. "Explain," he demanded. Kwon began to share what they had learned. David Kim was more than a researcher. His military records showed special training. His behavior during tests and the prison riot was unlike anything they had seen before. He guided prisoners, Kwon explained, not just his own species. Multiple alien species followed his instructions during the chaos. Another leader, with skin that seemed to change colors like a chameleon, spoke up. "How is this possible? Prisoners from different species never work together." David was brought into a special meeting room, not as a prisoner, but as something to be studied. The room was designed to be intimidating. Large screens surrounded him. Multiple alien officials watched from different angles. "Tell us about yourself," the red-skinned commander demanded. David looked directly at them. His eyes were calm. His body showed no fear. "I am Sergeant David Kim," he said simply. "United States Space Exploration Agency." But David knew this was more than a simple conversation. This was a battle of minds. He began to speak, not just answering questions, but asking them. He knew something about alien psychology. He understood how to make them think, how to make them question everything they knew. "Your prison system is interesting," David said, "but it has many weaknesses." The aliens were surprised. Most prisoners would be scared. Most would beg for mercy. But David was different. He began to explain how he had observed their systems, how he had understood the prison structure, how he had helped other prisoners survive. Each word was carefully chosen. Each sentence was a small weapon. Hyun Kwon watched carefully. The other officials became confused. David was not just answering questions. He was challenging their entire way of thinking. "Humans are not what you think," David said. "We adapt. We learn. We survive." The meeting became a strange game. David was not a prisoner anymore. He was turning the conversation, making the alien leaders listen to him. He talked about Earth, about human history, about how humans had survived difficult situations. Each story was a lesson. Each example was a challenge to their understanding. The alien leaders became quiet. They had expected a simple prisoner. They had found something much more complex. Hyun Kwon saw something the others missed. David was not just talking. He was teaching. He was showing them a different way of thinking. "Your systems are built on control," David said. "But true strength comes from understanding, from adaptation." The room felt different. The powerful alien leaders were now listening to a prisoner, a human who was supposed to be weak. David continued. He spoke about strategy, about survival, about the human ability to overcome impossible situations. Each word was a small battle. Each sentence was a weapon. The Galactic Empire had captured a human soldier, but they were discovering that David Kim was far more dangerous than any weapon. And this was just the beginning of their understanding. The prison station was different now. The recent riot had changed everything. Security systems were not as strong as before. Prisoners moved differently. Guards were more nervous. David Kim watched and waited. Hyun Kwon had been watching David carefully. Something about the human was different. Most prisoners would try to escape quickly, but David was patient. He was planning. In his cell, David had been collecting small pieces of technology. A broken sensor here, a damaged communication device there. To anyone else, they looked like trash. But David saw something more. The colored-changing prisoner across from David's cell continued to send signals. They had been communicating carefully, planning something big. David understood the prison's systems now. He knew how the energy fields worked. He had tracked guard movements. He had learned about alien technologies. One evening, everything changed. A small signal came. The colored-changing prisoner made a quick hand movement. Something was about to happen. David's modified device was ready. It looked like a simple piece of broken technology, but it could do much more. The guard rotation changed. New shifts came in. Everything looked normal, but David knew better. He began to move carefully, not rushing, not showing any signs of escape. Years of military training had taught him patience. The prison's main computer systems were still damaged from the recent riot. Communication between guard units was difficult. Some energy fields were not working correctly. David's device began to work, slowly, carefully. To the monitoring systems, everything looked normal. Hyun Kwan watched the security cameras. Something felt different tonight, but he could not explain why. Other prisoners began to move, not escaping, but preparing. David had been teaching them, showing them how to work together, how to survive. The first stage of the plan was simple: create confusion, make the guards nervous, show them that the prisoners were not helpless. Small systems began to fail. Lights flickered. Communication channels became jumbled. Nothing seemed seriously wrong, but everything felt off. David moved between prisoner groups, giving small signals, encouraging them to be ready, but not to escape. Not yet. Hyun Kwan became more interested. The human prisoner was doing something. But what? The prison station felt different. Prisoners from different species began to work together. Something David had quietly encouraged during his time here. Another small signal. The colored-changing prisoner moved slightly. The plan was coming together. David's modified device continued to work, weakening systems, creating small problems. Nothing that would cause a big alarm, just enough to make the guards nervous. Something is happening, Hyun Kwan muttered to himself. The Galactic Empire thought they had control. They thought they understood their prisoners. They were wrong. David Kim was about to show them how wrong they were. The escape was coming, but it would not be what anyone expected. This was more than a prison break. This was a message, and the Galactic Empire was about to receive it. The explosion was perfect, not too big, not too small. David Kim moved through the chaos like a shadow. The prison station shook. Alarms screamed. But David was calm. This was exactly what he had planned. Hyun Kwan watched from the control room. His eyes could not believe what was happening. The human prisoner was not just escaping. He was dismantling an entire space station's security system. Prisoners from different species followed David, not because he ordered them, but because they trusted him. During his time in prison, David had shown them something important, something the Galactic Empire did not understand. The color-changing prisoner was right beside David. They had planned this together. Small signals, careful movements. Each step was calculated. David's modified device had done its job perfectly. Communication systems were confused. Security protocols were breaking down. The prison station was falling apart, but in a way that looked almost planned. How is he doing this? Kwan muttered to himself. The escape was not about freedom. It was a message, a demonstration of human capability. David guided the prisoners. Not all would escape, but many would survive. He made sure of that. Years of military training had taught him about survival, about leaving no one behind. Escape pods began to launch, but not in a panic, in a careful, organized way. Something the Galactic Empire had never seen before from prisoners. Hyun Kwan realized something important. This was more than a prison break. This was a lesson. David reached the main hangar. A small research vessel waited. Not his original ship, but something he could use. His hands moved quickly over the controls. The vessel lifted smoothly. Around him, other prisoners found their ways to freedom. Some in escape pods, some in small ships, all guided by the lessons David had taught them. The prison station began to break apart, but not in a way that would kill the remaining prisoners. David had planned everything carefully. Unbelievable, Quan said. The small research vessel moved away from the dying prison station. David looked back, not with emotion, but with calculation. He had shown the Galactic Empire something important. Humans were not weak. Humans were not simple. Humans could adapt, could survive, could turn impossible situations into opportunities. Other alien species in the vessel looked at David. They saw something different now. Not a prisoner, not a human, but a leader. The communication systems of the vessel came to life. David began to send messages, not to Earth, but to the Galactic Empire. You captured a researcher, the message read, but you found a soldier. Hyun Quan received the message in the control room. He understood now. This was never about escape. This was about sending a message. The small research vessel disappeared into space. The prison station was nothing more than floating debris. But the impact would be felt across the galaxy. The Galactic Empire had learned something important. Humans were not what they thought. And David Kim was just the beginning. The galaxy would never be the same.